Hello, good evening everybody. My name's Lawrence Walsh, I'm the Chair of the Planning Committee. I'll just introduce everybody. On my right, Councillor Aidan Williams, the Vice Chair. On my left, our Senior Planning Officers. On my further right, our officers from Legal, Highways and Democratic Services. Down both legs of the table are members of Council who make up this Planning Committee. First item is attendances, and I've got apologies from Councillor Carey. Councillor Holden is stepping in for Councillor Carey. Thank you, Councillor Holden. There's no other apologies. Item number 2 is declarations of interest. Have any members of the Planning Committee got any interest to declare? Councillor Proctor.
3 applications, I'm afraid, Chair. Hale Bowling Pavilion and Hale Library. Last year I was the executive member for Communities and Housing, so I had an input into the housing and library service at that time, so I think it'd be appropriate I leave the meeting when those 2 items are discussed. And a further one, 15 Carswell Avenue in Urmston. I previously made representations on behalf of the applicant, so I think it'd be appropriate to leave the meeting at that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Proctor. Councillor Holden.
Thanks, Chair. I am a long-standing governor at Stretford Grammar School, so during that part of the meeting, I will absent myself and then rejoin you when that's been considered.
Thank you. Item number 3 is minutes of the previous meeting. Would anybody like to move those as a true and correct minute? Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Item number 4 is questions from members of the public. I understand that no questions have been submitted from members of the public. Item number 5 is the additional information report. I think there were copies at the front. Seem to be all been taken by members of the public. Please read those. They are the latest information on the committee report this evening. And item number 6 is applications to develop. Before we do that, there's a couple of messages that I've neglected to give you. Just a quick reminder to members of the Planning Committee, myself included, that as well as our local knowledge, we look to our local development plan and other background papers listed at the beginning of agenda item 6 as a basis for our decision making this evening. And more importantly, before we start, I'd like to convey the first fire safety notice for this evening. If the fire alarm, a continuous siren sounds, please could I ask that you leave the building in a calm manner by the nearest fire exit by proceeding left out of the room and down the main stairwell and out of the main civic entrance, which is opposite. Everyone should assemble at the front of the town hall and must not re-enter the building until instructed to do so. If you have a disability which could affect your means of escape, could you please inform a member of staff so that arrangements can be made for your safe evacuation. And we've also got broadcast information. Please be aware that this evening's meeting will be recorded for live and for subsequent broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel. The whole of the meeting will be recorded except where there are confidential or exempt items. This activity promotes democratic engagement in accordance with Section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972. The cameras will focus on the proceedings of the meeting and avoid areas specifically designated for members of the public. If you object to being filmed, please remain seated in the public seating area. All members and officers must use the microphone provided to enable the audio to be picked up by the system. Members are reminded to turn off their microphones when they are not formally addressing the committee. So we'll go to the first item on the agenda. And we're going to go to page 133. That's the School Development Site, Audley Avenue in Stretford. Before we begin, we're going to have an information update from Sarah. Councillor Jerome. One of the representations in support of this application, Councillor Trafford, please ask the committee member to Sorry, everybody. I just wanted to make a quick. No. Oh, apologies. That's okay. Thank you, Councillor Jerome. Sarah Lowes is going to give us an introduction. Miss Lowes, thank you.
Thank you. Introduction into the school development site on Audley Avenue, Stretford. Planning permission is sought for some minor amendments to the approved development for a new school to provide an enlarged building footprint to allow for a nursery provision to be provided for 12 pupils. This is in addition to some other minor alterations to some of the conditions. The application considers the impacts of the minor material amendments only. There have been 7 letters of objection in relation to the application in respect of the loss of trees, the impact on residential amenity, air quality, and highways issues. Officers consider that the proposal represents a minor change to the approved design and that it is acceptable in design terms, and it would have a limited impact on residential amenity, it would have limited impact on the local highways network, and is acceptable in all other respects. The application is therefore recommended for approval, subject to conditions and the completion of a deed of variation relating to the original Section 111 agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lowes. We have a speaker against this item. If I can find it. Mrs Smith. Do we have Mrs Smith? Mrs Smith? Mrs Smith, you're speaking in favour of the application. Sorry, please come and take a seat. And you have 3 minutes, Mrs Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application relates to the addition of a 12-place children's nursery at the approved Orchards SEN Primary School. The full planning permission for the erection of an SEN school at Audley Avenue was granted earlier this year. The original permission established the principle of development on the site, and this application solely relates to the inclusion of a 12-place nursery. The proposed nursery at the Orchards will provide 12 places for children between the ages of 2 and 4. The opportunity to integrate a nursery into the school will provide a self-contained SEN nursery and primary school for the continuity of children requiring SEN support in Trafford, and an improved local offer in accordance with the Council's SEN Vision for Change and Special Educational Needs and Disability Policy. The proposed nursery has secured funding from the Department for Education on this basis and is fully supported by the Dunham Trust. The proposed school is no closer to neighbouring properties on Audley Avenue to the south than the approved scheme, and will have no greater impact on the occupiers of the neighbouring properties. There are no proposed changes to the access arrangements to the school, the off-site highway improvements, and the number and layout of on-site car parking spaces. It is intended that all children will be collected and dropped off using school transport. However, transport analysis has been undertaken to consider 20% of the nursery children being dropped off by private car, equating to 8 vehicle movements at peak times. Within the overall proposal, there is a surplus in staff car parking spaces, as not all will travel to work. The surplus spaces could be used by parents to drop off and pick up nursery children. For these reasons, it is requested that you support the recommendation of approval. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms Smith. You'd like to return to your seat. With no other speakers on this item, would any members of Committee? Councillor Patel.
Thank you. Just to say, I recall that this application was approved in April of this year, and there was an extensive discussion by the Planning Committee at that time that particularly covered a lot of the issues that have been raised by the representations that have been received this time. I supported the proposals back in April, and I accept the officer recommendations this time. This is a rather minor change, and I welcome additional school nursery places in Trafford, and in particular SEND nursery places in Trafford. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patel. Councillor Cordingley.
Thank you, Chair. This application is in my ward, of Gorse Hill. I think it's fair to say we had some concerns over the location of this when it was initially broached. It's not the ideal spot for a school that's serving Old Trafford and all the Stretfords areas. So it's very much to the west of that. But I think those issues were settled at the last application. In terms of a nursery, the nursery is a vital part of this school, and I very much support having nursery provision. At the moment, children have to, if they do go into specialist school, they'll have to either go to Pictor or to Delamere. This actually is it makes a huge difference to their provision, because a lot of them actually don't go to specialist schools because there is none in the north for that age group, and they try to make do with mainstream, which actually puts them back. So I very much support this application in terms of putting a nursery in the orchards, because it's very much needed. And it's a minor planning change.
Thank you, Councillor Corden. Councillor Minnis.
I'm very much in support of the application. I think that obviously we have the application for a school anyway, and obviously echo the thing having nursery spaces. We don't have enough nursery spaces, especially. I think the continuity for children is important. One thing that I did spot was that where the school would be, where I don't know how to. Where you've got there's a strip of green space being left between the school and residential houses, and I thought that with obviously we're going to lose some trees in the development, that could trees be planted in that area, it would screen off a lot of any noise and additional pollution or anything. It would actually, the land isn't going to be used for anything else, so I don't see what's wrong with doing that, and it would improve it. That's the only comment I had for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Minnis. I'll ask Councillor Winstanley to comment, and perhaps an officer can come back to Councillor Minnis' suggestion. Councillor Winstanley.
Also speaking in favour of this, in general, given the very challenging nature of what special needs kids have to cope with on a daily basis, the idea of having a nursery on the same site as the main primary school is a brilliant idea. And also, given the fact it's only a minor change from the original planning application, I'm very much speaking in favour of this.
Thank you, Councillor Winstanley. Anybody else? Okay. Any officers like to comment on this suggestion by Councillor Minnis?
We think it might be a service access, Chairman, which would not make that possible, but we're just going to check the position.
We need to fill in the time while you're doing that. Councillor Jerome.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I also support this application. Early years SEN provision is so important and crucial. So I think this would be a great addition to the local area, and will be another outlet for that provision. So I'd fully support it also.
Thank you for that, Councillor John. Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. It's very repetitious, but obviously I also think that the nursery places are invaluable. They're very special places. I really treasure those. So really do welcome the application. And as people have said already, it's such a minor change. I don't think anybody will really have any concerns. So very happy to support the application.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to help you fill up a little more space while Mrs. Coley gets her paperwork together, I supported this application when it came to us before. I'm wholly in favour of the school as it is. I think it's an excellent facility. It will provide a much valued aspect of our education provision, which in Trafford is something we're all very proud of. And the fact that we can provide this specialist facility here is a good thing generally. This nursery provision simply further enhances that which is already to be provided, makes it even better than it was going to be previously. If this had been part of the original application, I would have been happy with that at the time, and I would have supported it in the way that I supported the previous application. So, Chairman, I've read the report. I've seen the objections. Most of the objections don't relate specifically to this nursery, but simply rehash the arguments of before. I'm afraid I disagreed with the objectors when it came before us previously. I disagree with the objectors at this stage, and I wholeheartedly support this addition to it. I look forward to my opportunity of voting in favour of it as and when Mrs. Coley finds the relevant section of her paperwork. So thank you, Chairman. I think I've sort of said.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Proctor wanted to come in. Quick comment, Councillor Proctor. Councillor Proctor. Ms Coley.
There is a landscaping buffer shown in that part. The service access is further to north. What we can't get hold of is the precise landscaping plan that has been signed off already in relation to the previous application, which may show some trees on there.
Can I, it's so, you know, you see the group of trees.
Yeah,
about
to the, yeah, to the west,
yeah, so the left,
yeah,
effectively there along that strip where it looks bare, if that's where I mean, if there can be a set of trees there, you know, it fits in with the council's you know, recent motion with planting more trees anyway as well.
That would require an amendment to the condition that's already been approved. There are trees shown on the on the eastern side, but not on the western side. Whether that's because there's a service is running through there, I'm not sure. It does seem to have been done for a reason. If you're happy for us to go and ask the question of the applicant, then we can do that and then sort it out if we can, and if we can't, then if the committee are generally happy with that, then we will do.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Minnis. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Has it been seconded? Councillor Patel moved it. Councillor Bunting seconded. It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against? Nobody against. That's unanimous. The application has been approved. The next item I'm going to go to is page number 1. That's 1332 Derbyshire Lane in Stretford. And we'll take the speaker against first, I think. Councillor Jerome. Could I now make my quick declaration? Somebody who's made a representation in support of this application is a Trafford Green Party committee member and friend, but I've had no contact or communication with her about this application, and everything I've looked into has been independent, so I've come to my own independent conclusions on this. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Jerome. Dr. Delockery, is Dr. Delockery here? If you'd like to take a seat. And before you begin, Dr. Delockery, we've got an introduction from, sorry, apologies, Dr. Delockery, you take a seat. Before you begin, we've got an introduction from Miss Lowes. Miss Lowes.
Thank you. The application relates to 2 adjacent large detached properties on Derbyshire Lane, known as Dover House and Derby House. The properties are currently vacant, although last in use as care homes. Permission is sought for the use of the buildings to be used jointly as a care home. In 1995, permission was granted to convert Dover House number 30 into a care home, and a condition of this permission restricted the care home for use for the elderly. It is important to note that number 32 Derbyshire Lane had an open residential care home use with no restrictions. The permission seeks to use both of the sites as one care facility and remove the condition relating to 30 Derbyshire Lane, which restricts the occupancy on that part of the site to elderly people. Therefore, regard needs to be had to the real fallback position in that 32 Derbyshire Lane could operate independently as an unrestricted care facility without further requirement for planning permission. As such, it is only the additional impact of the proposed unrestricted care home use at 30 Derbyshire Lane and the operating of the 2 buildings together as one that should be considered in this application. This application gives the opportunity to control this use to ensure that the impact on the immediate locality is limited. Objections have been received in relation to parking and highways, residential amenity, and in regards to the future residents and safeguarding issues. On this issue, the care provider and the levels of management will be subject to separate regulations outside of the planning process, which seek to address any safeguarding issues. Notwithstanding this, it is not within the remit of the planning process to seek to control the proposed service users or provide a judgment on the risk from one particular demographic over another. In this regard, the proposal is considered to comply with the relevant planning policies and is recommended for approval subject to conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lowes. Dr. Delockery, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
The main objections are the safeguarding and the safety of the school children at the 4 schools in the vicinity of the proposed care home has not been properly considered. Inadequate consultation of everyone likely to be impacted by the development and increased parking problems in an already difficult area. The suitability of having the proposed care facility in the vicinity of 4 local schools and the fact that no risk assessment has been undertaken is of great concern to the headmaster and teachers of St Anne's School, the parents and grandparents of children at the school and local residents. Northern Healthcare were asked about psychotic issues in an email. They replied, if a client does not take prescribed medicine, they recognise that it may cause a detrimental impact on that individual. The individuals who are proposed to be residents in the care home will have their own tenancies and the same rights as you and I in our homes. They also wrote, ultimately, it is the individual's responsibility to take their medication. This response from Northern Healthcare focuses only on the individual care home residents. No risk assessment has been taken into potential of such an instance impacting upon the local school children or indeed the residents of the care home. Additionally, the report to the committee in the section Planning, Balance and Conclusions, the planning officer states there is no evidence to suggest that there is any increased risk to the children and residents. How the planning officer can make this statement when no risk assessment has been undertaken, and what qualifies the planning officer to make this statement. Trafford Council and the councils have a duty of care to all the children at the schools in Trafford. The residents of Derbyshire Lane in the vicinity of the care home were not informed of the meeting about the care home at St Anne's School. The views of Trafford Education have not been sought. The owners of St Anne's School, Salford Diocese, and number 28 Derbyshire Lane were not informed of the planning application, which is required under the planning regulations. The residents of 28B Derbyshire Lane, next to Dover House, are extremely concerned as their side door is only 6 foot from the cellar window, a large window and a bedroom window. Their great-grandson, age 5, who lives with them, plays on the outside door. They're extremely concerned about the additional possible risk due to the close proximity. In conclusion, we're asking the committee to consider the following: defer planning permission until a complete risk assessment has been undertaken by appropriately qualified professionals and residents and the schools informed of the outcome. Defer planning permission until a complete assessment and the views have been given by Trafford Education Department. Defer planning permission until a wider consultation of the views of parents of school children and local residents in the vicinity of the care home. Defer planning permission until Salford Diocese and number 28 Derbyshire Lane have time to respond. I have a condition of approval for this application subject to being only for residents with learning difficulties, particularly if high risks are identified.
Thank you, Dr. DeLucre. You'd like to return to your seat. Thank you. We have Councillor Harding here this evening. Councillor Harding is going to speak in favour of the application. Councillor Harding is a councillor. She has 5 minutes. Thank you, Councillor Harding.
Thank you, Chair. So I speak really as the Executive Member for Adult Social Care in support of this application. Firstly, can I say how disappointed I am at some of the objections that have come in regarding this application, but I do accept that some of those concerns are based on fear. And one of the things that it has highlighted for me is that the role Trafford Council and Trafford CCG have to try and mitigate some of that fear and genuinely engage with residents around reducing the stigma around mental health. And I really feel that's a job that I will take forward as the exec member. These houses will look to support people 18 plus that have experienced and may continue to experience mental health issues. There may well be some provision for learning disability support too. But can I say, as a former mental health practitioner, I wish to point out that mental health is a very broad spectrum of issues that people may present with. That can range from anxiety and depression right through to schizophrenia and bipolar. And the provider, Northern Healthcare, was established to support a whole range of presentations of mental health conditions. And I want to be explicitly clear that these properties will not be psychiatric inpatient units. They are not going to be secure units. They are intended to be homes for people that are looking to recover and improve their mental health and well-being. And I think as a council, we have a duty and an obligation to ensure that every resident has the opportunity, and particularly to ensure that Trafford residents are not placed miles away from Trafford and are able to live in their local community with support. Some of these people may have been in hospital, may have lost the capacity to live on their own, lost the capacity to budget, to cook, to just live independently. And basically, they will go through a very robust risk assessment and screening process from a multidisciplinary team of professionals that will make a decision as to whether that individual is okay to live in a supported housing property. It will be a supportive and caring environment, and we are looking to really improve and assist people's well-being. Can I just say that any one of us could be living across the road from somebody experiencing mental health problems such as depression or schizophrenia or bipolar, living across the road from somebody who doesn't have such support, who may well not be taking their medication. We could also well be living next door to a perpetrator of domestic abuse. I just want to put risk into some kind of context here, really. So as I've said, really, anybody living at these properties will have been through a very thorough risk assessment. There'll have been a clinical assessment, a full screening process. And I just want to say again that the figure 1 in 4 is a very stark figure. There really, for the grace of God, go any of us when it comes to experiencing mental health issues. And it's incumbent upon all of us to reduce the stigma. All residents will be supported in case there is any lapse in any of their mental health and well-being. There is a full clinical support team on site 24 hours. It is a medical model where there are clinical staff, but it's also a model that's about promoting recovery. So what we would hope to happen is that people live there for a period of time and they are then supported to go and live independently. But you're absolutely right, this isn't about the planning committee making that decision. This is about the property of a change of age range. What we will do, Trafford as an authority, is work with the provider Northern Healthcare to ensure that as commissioners of healthcare packages, we are completely satisfied with any governance procedures around mental health support. I've met with the providers. There was a consultation at the school and another consultation was offered. We have tried to engage with residents, and if the planning permission is passed, the plan is that the providers will look to work with the community to ensure that anybody that resides at those properties is supported and is truly part of our community. So the organisation are very, very keen to work with the community. As exec for social care, I just want to say that I actually think we need more facilities and more supported housing to ensure that people can live independent lives. And I think really that's all I would say. I just want to say that, you know, from a personal point of view, my uncle, aged 12, was taken into a facility because he was considered a bit different. 40 years of his life lost in a facility when he's now at home living independently with carers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harding. Would you like to return to your seat? Do we have Mr. Tracy? Mr. Tracy, if you'd like to take a seat. And you have 3 minutes, Mr. Tracy.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Noel Tracy, and I'm the Chief Executive of Northern Healthcare. I'm a registered mental health nurse, which I have been doing for this last 30 years. Northern Healthcare are the care provider, working very closely with the local commissioners in both social services and the NHS, and we are registered with the CQC. We recently had an inspection last week, and we came out of that with at least a good, if not outstanding, rating. We are here to look at, and I think my colleague earlier stated about the fear aspect and the stigma attached around mental health. These figures of 1 in 4 of us will need mental health services at some point in our life isn't just a number that the government's used, it's fact. Most of us, until we need it, never look at it. We always want to say, doesn't bother me, I'll forget about it. Currently, in Manchester as a whole, people sometimes have to travel 200 miles to get an appropriate bed because of the reduction in mental health beds across not just Manchester, but across the country. These people that will reside in the 2 properties are people who may have been in hospital, have got themselves to a level of wellness, but the big thing that people need to realize is that stress is one of the biggest causes of relapse of the mental health. These people come out are often very vulnerable. The stresses of everyday life, of being able to budget, being able to cook for themselves, and dealing with other factors within the community can often be the factor that causes them to relapse. The objectors had said about risk. As a nurse that's worked in secure services through all levels, I am qualified in numerous risk assessments, and I've got a young family myself. I wouldn't place my own family at risk no more than it would place any of the local community at risk. Northern Healthcare, we're a caring provider. We've got services throughout the Northwest and other parts of the country. And one of our main aims is to have clinical professionals, support staff there 24 hours a day, but also a big emphasis is around integration into the community. Our nearest unit here in Radcliffe currently has 9 people who work in the local community, either in voluntary works or in paid employment. For us, that is the gold standard. We recognise that if you've got a reason to get up in the morning, it's one of the reasons why you will maintain your mental health. We all need that for a thing. I've got nothing further to say.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. If you'd like to return to your seat. Have the debate. Councillor Bunting, you'd like to begin?
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard a great deal from, for example, from the objector regarding safety, risk assessments and all that kind of matter. As has been pointed out on numerous occasions in this committee, it's not for the Planning and Development Control Committee to impinge on matters which are dealt with by other regulatory bodies. We deal with planning decisions and only planning decisions. Everything else is irrelevant. Therefore, matters such as the risk assessments and whether this council has carried them out, of course it hasn't, it's not our job so to do. That is a matter for Northern Healthcare, and their assessments and the way they carry out their job is dealt with by other regulatory bodies, for example the CQC, who deal with that. That's their job, this is ours. As was pointed out in the introduction from the planning officer, we essentially only really have 2 questions to ask ourselves this evening. One is the fact that the 2 buildings are being merged into essentially a single facility. Is that a problem? And 2 is the removal of the age restriction in terms of number 30. Is that a problem? Those are essentially the planning questions that we're asking ourselves tonight. All the rest of it is for other regulatory bodies, other things. I may agree that this is a fantastic facility to have in Trafford. I may agree that this is something that is maybe needed in the local area, that people don't want to be pushed away to facilities far away from their friends and family. I might think those things, but that is not the point I'm being asked to consider this evening. I'm only being asked to consider the planning matters in front of me. I cannot see any particular reason why the removal of the age restriction in relation to number 30 would cause a problem. I cannot see a reason why the merger of these 2 facilities into a single facility would cause a problem. Ergo, I have no planning ground on which to object to this application. And therefore, given the fact that presumption is in favour of development, unless there is a reason not to develop, I am therefore in support of this on planning grounds. And for those reasons, Chairman, I'm supporting the officer recommendation of grant. As I'm the first speaker, I am more than happy to propose the officer recommendation be accepted. And with that, there is nothing really more for me to say. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. As a previous member has said, Councillor Bunting, just looking at it in terms of planning, there is absolutely no reason for us not to recommend grant for this application. One home was previously looking after elderly patients, and the other unit had unrestricted use. So all we're really being asked, as we've already been told, is looking at the change of use, change of ages at one of the properties, and is the use in general good. And I think, as Councillor Bunting has said, I think that's really, there's absolutely nothing that I can see that would be a reason to not recommend grant. So on that point, I definitely support the application. And I have to say, although I totally understand residents' concerns, I totally understand them, I found the round of applause at the end of the objector's speech to be absolutely heartbreaking. As a medically qualified person, mental health should be treated and handled and considered in exactly the same way as physical ill health. And as someone said, I think Councillor Harding said that we can consider mental health as something that, you know, someone could be mentally ill across the way, across the road, and we wouldn't know, so why should we object? But we ourselves can be mentally ill. We can be living with somebody that's mentally ill. And I think we have to be really sensitive and be really realistic and consider, without stigma and without prejudice, that because this is a mental health facility, it shouldn't make any difference. If it was a physical health facility, would you have the same objections? So I think really, I couldn't support any objection on that ground, even though it's not a planning matter. I think it's really important that members of the committee make it very clear, well, I certainly want to make it clear, that there must be no disparaging of mental health issues. They must be treated completely equally. And this is a fantastic facility. It's a transition place for people who've come out of hospital, who have been seriously ill and who perhaps in hospital needed a lot of intensive care and may have had legal requirements to stay within the facility. But this is a transition unit. The people within it will not be as poorly as they were as if they'd been in hospital. There's very good staff numbers. There's a well recommended and well reviewed provider providing healthcare services. So and I think we also have to say that when it was previously an all people's care home, a lot of elder people have mental health issues. So you will have already, if you lived in the road at the time that that was functional, you would have had elderly patients with mental health issues. Did you experience any issues? No. Were there any concerns? I don't think so. So I think from all of those points of view, but obviously particularly from the planning view, because we are a planning committee, I have absolutely no hesitation in recommending the application, and I'm very happy to second it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Dr. Balky. Councillor Minnis.
I just have a question. So I was having a look at obviously parking spaces because of the staff levels. So as far as I could work out, there were 6 parking spaces shown on one of the pictures. I'd have to try and find it on the planning portal. And the number of, in the daytime, the number of staff that you'll have is a minimum of 9. So, and there's obviously additional people that would be there, visitors, additional health team, cleaners, caterers, caretakers, etc. So I'm just wondering how parking would be resolved.
Mr. Evanson, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, in terms of the facility, there is an actual reduction in beds at the site over the two homes, and whilst I accept that there will be a level of staff there, the maximum requirements for Trafford is 1 space for 5 beds, and there's 9 beds in each of the dwellings. So the actual proposal and the parking, it fully accords with the requirements in the standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evanson.
It's yes, I understand what you're saying. Per number of beds, you've got enough parking spaces, but we're talking about the level of care obviously required for the residents of these houses would be it requires nine staff as a minimum in the day. So whether you've got so many beds, it's not about the number of beds, it's about the number of staff that you're going to have there, about ratios of staff to residents.
Yeah, I do accept and I do acknowledge in terms of the argument, but the SPD, which we go by, the requirement is, the assumption is based on number of beds, and it fully accords with the requirements within the standards, and it achieves over and above what is actually required.
Thank you, Mr. Evanson. Ms. Coley.
Yeah, we're looking at the staffing list that's in the committee report, and it doesn't seem to indicate that there would be anywhere near 9 staff on site at any one time. It would be nearer 4 or 5, if at a maximum.
Okay, you've got a ratio of 1 to 3 staff during the day.
Yeah.
So for the residents, that's to look after to help these residents. That's so if you've got 18 residents, you're talking about 6 there, and that's without your occupational therapist, your full-time manager. So we're talking there are 9.
Okay. 7.
Honestly, I've
Still not.
It's on page 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, even if we took that as 9, the relevant standard is our car parking standard, not the number of staff on site. That's not how we measure it. So the
okay.
standard to be imposed is the car parking standard in our local plan.
Okay, I think it might need to change.
Councillor Holden, you'd like to comment?
Thank you, Chair. I find myself in an interesting position with this application. Some of you will remember that last year I came before you to support my local residents who were objecting to a not dissimilar facility, a little smaller but not dissimilar. And you'll also remember that my approach was slightly less cultural than usual, and I simply used the opening lines of Minder. Right people, right time, just wrong location. The wrong location argument doesn't exist here. This is perfectly positioned. The people who are going to be running it, even before I'd heard him speak tonight, are at the top of their game, and there can be no question at all that we need facilities like this. So I will enthusiastically, on my one ever occasion where I'll sit on the planning committee, support this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holden. Councillor Cordingley.
Thanks, Chair. I feel it is incumbent to just test this representation argument a little bit more, because it was the main theme of the residents' submission that there hadn't been sufficient consultation with the school and the diocese. I realise that the additional information addresses that, but I wonder if officers could clarify whether we've had any representation from the diocese or the school, because they're perfectly entitled to write in.
And we have had representation from the school, yes. I'm not aware we've had them directly from the diocese, but there was absolutely no obligation for us to write to the diocese.
I think we need to reiterate the point. There's nothing to stop the diocese writing in. The invitation of a letter is to alert them. If the school has alerted the diocese, then they're entitled to write in. And I think we need to sort of address that argument, because it was one of the main themes within the verbal submission, that a deferment was asked for on the basis that the diocese hadn't been invited. They could have written in.
Else wish to comment? Councillor Proctor.
Thank you, Chair. I think echoing what some people have said already, this kind of revision is very much needed in Trafford, but we do need to consider this application on its particular merits as an application in itself. So, we need to put that aside and just look at it as a pure application. There has been a lot of representation from residents with concerns and one letter of support. The main focus of this seems to be around parking and highway problems, and obviously the safeguarding issue, which has been discussed already, due to the nature of the younger nature of the proposed new occupants. Looking at the information, I don't really accept the parking will have been an issue. There's a large amount of hard standing around both properties, which could be used for parking, and the condition of the parking layout is recommended prior to being brought back into use. The location is also good for public transport links along the A56 with buses, a railway and Metrolink close by. The other highway areas that have been included in the report are such as parking across driveways are not something that we can take into account as a planning committee. I do understand some of the concerns being raised by the local residents, and I think Mr. DeLucre has expressed those very well here tonight. But saying that, I think something we can't really take into account because of the nature of what we do in planning. Although I think what Councillor Harding and Mr. Tracy said tonight has reassured me a lot more that any potential issues will be mitigated, and the safety of the people in the local community will be okay. So I will be voting for this application. To agree it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Proctor. Anybody else? Councillor Jerome.
Yeah, just very quickly. I don't want to walking around the both houses. If you walk to the back, they're actually very well landscaped and screened. So people have got lots of space in there to relax, and I think it would be good for their well-being, and kind of means that the facility has got a lot of space for them to use, and I think it's a good facility, well staffed, and like other people have said, a very good provision for Trafford.
I think we've had quite a thorough discussion on this item, and everybody's had a chance to speak. Can I just say, I live quite close to this area. I'm very familiar with it, and to the members, residents, and neighbours around this area, what we're saying is the issues that you raise are not for the planning committee to make a decision on. It wouldn't be right that we did that. But I'm confident that there are checks and balances in the system with the councils. Councillor Harding has talked about, and Mr. Tracy's talked about as well, about working with the community in the future to make sure this facility is not cause any difficulties or problems for the residents in that area. So I'm quite comfortable with that. And I say that as a local resident. I live very close by and I'm very familiar with the area. It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against, that application has been granted. Thank you. We're going to go to page 30. That's Hale Bowling Pavilion, Cecil Road in Hale. And we have 3 speakers to this item. Speaking against this item, we have Mr. Kilshaw. Do we have Mr. Kilshaw? Mr. Kilshaw, if you'd like to take a seat. Councillor Proctor's excusing himself from the meeting. Ms. Cody. And before you begin, Mr. Kilshaw, we have an introduction from Ms. Coley. Ms. Coley.
Thank you, Chairman. This application relates to the site of the existing bowling green pavilion in Hale. It also includes part of the Cecil Road public car park. The application is connected to the subsequent application on this agenda, which concerns the site of the existing Hale Library at Lee Road. The bowling green application involves the demolition of the existing pavilion and the erection of a multifunctional community building, including a new library. The proposal has been the subject of a lengthy design review process in order to secure design quality. In this respect, it has been acknowledged that the site has design sensitivity in view of its prominence, its conservation area location, and its relationship with the bowling green. While significant improvements to design, scale, siting, and landscaping have been secured, it is nonetheless concluded that the proposed development would still result in harm to the significance of the Hale Station conservation area. The level of harm has been categorised as less than substantial in NPPF terms. The NPPF advises that it is necessary to consider whether wider public benefits would outweigh the level of harm caused. In this respect, it is considered that there is a clear and convincing public benefits case, since the development is founded on maintaining and enhancing important existing community resources. As such, it's concluded that the less than substantial harm to the heritage asset would be outweighed by the public benefits. It has also been concluded that any adverse impacts arising from the scheme overall would not significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. Therefore, planning permission should be granted. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Mr. Kilshaw, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the residents of the immediate vicinity of both planning applications 97375 97376. We have not been consulted by the Hale Community Trust or the local councils in respect to these developments, even though they say they have. We believe that we're being misled by the Hale Community Trust and their developers, Hillcrest Homes. Nobody's denying that the cottage building at the bowling green is in need of some TLC, but a building at least 8 times the size is not necessary. The Hale Community Trust states that the building will be in keeping with its surroundings and will not dominate the bowling green site. How big does the proposed building need to be before it would dominate the site when it's 8 times the size? Sufficient health and safety and parking assessments have not been carried out in relation to the proposal. There are far too many blind spots already in the Cecil Road car park, and these are set to get much worse. The proposed building extends the building into the car park by more than 2.7 metres. It is only a matter of time before there's a serious injury or even a fatality. Parking is already at saturation point in Hale, and we stand to lose numerous parking spaces if these planning applications are granted, both in terms of in and around the current library site and also the Cecil Road car park and Cecil Road itself. Insufficient parking spaces will impact on local residents, result in less visitors and shoppers, and ultimately lead to closed businesses within the Hale area. Hale does not need yet another licensed premises. There are already no less than 28 eating places or drinking places within the Hale area on Ashley Road. We don't want more disturbance on an ongoing basis, with both music and people entering and leaving the building up until 11:30 at night. Further noise and misery when deliveries are made and when refuse and glass are collected from 8 PM to 7 AM are also in the plans. There will be a loss of amenity to the community. Both the bowling green and the cottage fall within the Hale Station Conservation Area. This policy states that any building that is destroyed must only be replaced by a building of the same size and scale. The proposed building is more than 2.5 times the height and more than 1.5 times the width of the current cottage, and would definitely have an incremental harmful effect on the character of the conservation area. It is a complete overdevelopment of the site. It will totally dwarf the surrounding properties, all of which stand no more than 7 metres. This excessive 10-metre height building will block both light and outlook for all neighbouring properties. It will be completely intrusive and an invasion of privacy. There is also damage to the environment. We are being led to believe that there will be no destruction to the beautiful mature trees that provide the backdrops to the bowling green. But how can this be when the new building will be 26 metres wide? Yeah. In summary, this proposal building is overbearing, out of character, and a giant eyesore, and is set to destroy our beautiful community, not hold it together. This is not an application for a community centre. This is an excuse to build another function room by a group of greedy property developers that are set to make a considerable amount of financial gain out of both sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kilshaw. If you'd like to return to your seat. Do we have Mr. Luton? Mr. Luton, if you'd like to take a seat, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Is that better? Thank you. I'm a trustee of the Hale Community Trust, HCT, and I'm speaking on their behalf and the wider community of Hale who support our application. HCT is a registered charity that was formed when the council announced their intention to redevelop the current library site on Lee Road, Hale. This project is strategic to the future of Hale. It retains the library, which has the second highest footfall in Trafford. It provides an opportunity to provide new additional amenities. It's an exciting project which is supported by the overwhelming majority of the residents in Hale. Typical comments we get are brilliant, get on with it, about time, just what our children need. The application before you is a proposal to develop a new community centre which will incorporate the new library Also provide new facilities for the bowling club, the senior social group, and new flexible accommodation for meetings, activities, socialising, providing refreshment facilities, and new toilets. And I think when we make a comparison, it's important that we compare like with like. We are replacing all of those facilities, not just the existing pavilion. The centre will be a community asset managed and maintained by the community, and therefore details like what hours and what events it holds will be entirely up to the management committee, which will be put in place. The project on completion will reduce the costs currently incurred by the council considerably, although they will continue to run the library, providing books and personnel. The current building, a library, is very expensive to run. It has a very low environmental standard, and it will be replaced by one meeting current standards. There will also be improvements to the landscaping on Cecil Road and around the building. It's important to make the point that the mature trees, which were mentioned by my predecessor, will all be maintained. Those are mentioned in paragraph 32. Trees T18 and T12 will be retained. In addition to that, an extra 12 trees will be planted to replace the loss of minor trees. They will be positioned along the car park side of Cecil Road, which will help to improve the view from the Cecil Road residences. We have support, as mentioned. There were 250 representations on the planning portal, 195 supporters and 27 objectors. We have now 990 registered supporters. We have an email database.
If you'd like to sum up, Mr. Luton, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Luton. If you'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Mrs. Pat Young, would you like to take a seat? And you have 5 minutes, Councillor Young. Thank you.
I was a little puzzled to hear the gentleman who spoke first talk about the possible use for the building. If you look on page 48, paragraph number 43, you'll see that clubs that have already affiliated or have expressed an interest in using the new space include a senior citizens group, a dementia society, exercise classes, baby and toddler groups, youth groups, and the Scrabble club. I don't think these are going to keep the people in Hale awake till 11 o'clock at night with wild drinking and anything. Also, there was mention made that there was no consultation. Now, I know for a fact that a very extensive consultation was carried out. I had a number of residents, I can't tell you how many, actually phoning me up, and I'm only one of the councillors. My colleague, Councillor Mitchell, who was leading on this, had many, many more people. A very, very lengthy consultation took place in Hale Library, at which time any members of the community were able to come in and discuss the proposed application. Hale has never had a community centre, and this application is a purpose-built one, which includes a new public library, as well as providing a base for various other community groups. I am delighted that this application has been recommended for approval, and I would like to thank the planning officers who, together with the Hale Community Trust, Hale Civic Society, and Hillcrest Homes have worked so hard to discuss, coordinate, consult, plan, and work with everyone interested to bring this application to this totally satisfying conclusion. I know that work on this application has been ongoing for many years, and a large number of Trafford officers and members of the public have been involved. And it is good that ultimately such a satisfying conclusion has been reached. And I'm actually certain that in the future, the entire community of Hale will be proud of this new building, which will promote social interaction and availability of public areas and spaces for all members of Hale, and indeed all members of the South Trafford community. So thank you, officers, for this.
Thank you, Councillor Young. If you'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Bunting, you'd like to begin the debate.
Thank you, Chairman. This is quite a well, obviously I appreciate we only deal with the first of the application, but this, specifically in relation to this bowling green, this is probably, in my view, probably one of the best things to have happened to the Hale area in a long time. It's very much overdue. In terms of the arguments that were put forward against it by the objector who spoke previously, arguing like things like people hadn't been consulted. Well, we've got over 200 letters, admittedly mostly in favour, but over 200 letters regarding this. So somebody somewhere knew this was happening. You know, we've also had many other representations made through the councillors, because of course people are not obliged to write in directly. So we can add yet more people in that way. So I think the argument that consultation didn't go out there, well, people are well aware of it, as we can evidence from that. So I think that argument is perhaps difficult to sustain. In terms of the building being larger than it is at the moment, well, yes, that's because it's going to do a great deal more than it does at the moment, and it will also combine that which is on two sites as well. So therefore, we need to take that into account. So again, that argument is perhaps difficult to sustain in terms of arguing against it. In terms of the parking and traffic safety, well, I don't believe, I've looked at the design, I've looked at the plans. I can't agree that this is going to cause a sort of localized death trap that is going to be wiping out the firstborn of all Hale residents in the future. So again, I'm finding that difficult to sustain as well. As Councillor Mrs. Young made very apparent with the list of potential users of this facility, it's hardly going to be the sort of den of iniquity that was perhaps suggested, and that it will not be keeping the local residents up at night with the various groups that are planning on using it. This is an overall win-win scenario. We are getting a brand new community centre that will provide far more facilities to the local people. It will ensure that the library is kept open. It will be facilities for the bowlers. Obviously, the bowling green is not part of this specific site because the red line goes around it, but it will provide bowling club facilities for those to ensure that bowling green has a future. It is difficult to think of too many problems with this site, looking at it from the views out, and there are so many wins. So in terms of the planning balance that we always have to bring ourselves to in relation to this matter, this would seem to me to be a very one-sided argument. A great deal in favour, and you have to really try to find problems with it. So on that basis, Chairman, I am more than happy to propose that we go with the officer's recommendation of grant. I think we are perhaps in danger, if anything, Chairman, of selling this item short. This is a big win for the local area, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we've got this proposal in front of us. I look forward to listening to what my colleagues have to say on this one, and hope, fingers crossed, that other people in this room are as keen on it as I am. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Winstanley.
Thank you, Chair. My original response is probably very similar to Councillor Bunting's. When I read the papers, and then when I went to see the site, I couldn't see that it was anything other than a good idea in terms of aesthetics, and also a good idea in terms of planning to do what is being planned to do. But hearing the first speaker, I have a smaller area of concern, because what really swung it for me was when reading the papers, there was this huge support expressed from the community. but the first speaker said there was no consultation. So is it possible to describe what the consultation actually was?
There has been a great deal of consultation about these proposals. The applicant has carried out their own. They were at Hale Library for, I think, more than a week, and we wrote extensively to neighbours and put up a number of site notices as we're required to, exceeding all statutory requirements. I cannot agree that there was a lack of consultation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, when I first heard about the proposal for a new building to support the bowling green and the library moving over, I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and that was many, many years ago. I can't think how many years ago it was, but certainly not in my recent memory. It's from way back in my memory. And when it was actually first mooted, I hoped and prayed it would come forward and that we would see something. And obviously, as time has passed, we haven't actually had anything before planning committee. So I'm absolutely thrilled that tonight we actually have an application that is before us, that has officers' recommendation for approval, and it certainly has my wholehearted support. As somebody who uses Hale, I go through Hale, I see the bowling green, I see the surroundings of the bowling green, I use the library, I see the library. Both of those buildings are really tired, and the library is really, really old and tired. In the summer, it's so well used. I know that all the school children go and do the revision there. It's a fantastically used library. It's amazing that we're going to have a brand new library to support all the needs of the residents locally, not just school children, but it's a really fantastic facility. And I'm absolutely thrilled to see it coming forward. And I just hope that I don't have to wait as long to see it built. And with that, Chairman, I give my wholehearted support. I'm very happy to second the application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dr. Barclay. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. I don't intend to speak at any great length to this application because it strikes me as a bit of a no-brainer, if I'm being honest. Like Mr. Luton highlighted and a number of other members have touched on, I take a huge amount of reassurance from the significant number of positive representations that were received in support of the application. But having said that, I do want to acknowledge one part of Mr. Kilshaw's representation, because he talked about concerns about the size and the scale of the development, and that it's replacing a building that's largely about 8 times smaller than it. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that concern. But when I was reading the report, what I took to be quite reassuring was that paragraphs 13 through to 45, they provide a commentary about that concern. They acknowledge that this is a large development in the site that it's contained. And ultimately, I suppose I had to take reassurance that officers have made a conclusion that whilst there is some harm from the scale of the development, it's less than substantial, and the benefits outweigh any downside to that. I think it's a really robust report. As I've said, I take a huge amount of reassurance from that. I'd just say in closing, I spent my early years growing up in Hale, and it strikes me that Hale's needed a facility like this for the best part of 3 decades at least. I personally feel that Hale's lost out since the largely successful redevelopment of Altrincham, really. And I really hope that once this development's brought forward, it's capable of giving Hale a sort of renewed lease of life. So if the application hasn't yet been proposed and seconded, I'm more than happy to do so for either of those. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Patel.
Thank you. Just briefly, it's a very exciting project, and it's clear that a lot of work has gone into developing a well-designed, well-thought-out scheme. The facilities within the development look amazing, and I think it's positive that the opportunity to provide an upgrade in community facilities has been seized, really. It's an opportunity that's been seized, and I'm pleased to see that. One thing I would say, I would hope, it's not really a planning matter, I'm afraid, is that the committee that manages these community facilities maintains an open approach to engaging with all parts of the Hale community, so that all residents have equal access to these facilities. And if approved, I look forward to visiting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patel. Councillor Jerome.
Yeah, there's much in this application to support, but I've got some real problems with it. It doesn't promote active travel in any way, and Councillor Williams referred to Altringham's success. Much of that success is down to pedestrianisation, cycle parking, great transport links, but the MPPF clearly states that we should be seeking, meeting the needs of future generations, and in SDP we should be promoting sustainable transport. But if you look at the location site plan, there's only 4 Sheffield stands being made available in such a large building. So this is a building that's very much being predicated around car use. And you can see by the ample car parking. And one of the problems with Hale, I think, is the amount of cars that are coming into the town centre day after day. And we know where there's cycling improvements put in place and economies grow and develop. So I really like and support this application in many ways, but I'm struggling to agree with it until a better travel plan and better facilities for cycling is put in place.
Thank you, Councillor John. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. Like some of the other speakers have said, I did have a slight concern about the scale impact, and of course losing any car parking spaces in Hale is disappointing. But I'm going to thoroughly support this plan. I think it's an excellent improvement to the village. It improves the bowling green, and it becomes a real focus for the village. And I'm hopeful there'll be a real focus for regeneration, not just for the village, but the wider Hale community. So I will be supporting it tonight.
Okay, if there's no other speakers, it's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against? That application has been granted. Thank you. I'm going to go to page 65. That's Hale Library, Lee Road in Hale. And Mr. Kilshaw, if you'd like to take a seat. You will have 3 minutes to speak, but before you do, Ms. Coley is going to give us an introduction.
This application relates to the site of the existing library in Hale and is connected to the previous application which concerned the site of the bowling green. The Lee Road application involves the demolition of the existing library and the redevelopment of the site. 6 new houses are proposed together with 2 residential apartments which will be provided above new retail floor space. The existing library would not close until the new library at the bowling green site would be open to the public. This proposal has also been the subject of a lengthy design review process in order to secure design quality. In this respect, it has been acknowledged that the site has design sensitivity in view of its adjacency to a Grade 2 listed building and the Hale Station Conservation Area, albeit no harm is identified to heritage assets from these proposals. The MPPF's presumption in favour of sustainable development is triggered in this application, since policies of most importance in its determination are out of date. The key benefits of this application are associated with its ability to provide new housing on a brownfield site and in a central and accessible location. Whilst only providing 8 units, it's considered that weight should be afforded to the contribution given the current substandard housing supply figure for Trafford and the elevated annual housing requirement. The new retail unit would also support the function of Hale District Centre. These important benefits have been weighed against the residual harms arising, including to visual and residential amenity. However, it's been concluded that any adverse impacts would not significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. It's therefore considered that planning permission should be granted. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Mr. Kilshaw.
Thank you, Chair. Just to reiterate some of the previous points, obviously this application is heavily linked with the previous application. One of the major points in the 2 applications is that the sale of the current library site is to finance the actual building of the new library. And then once both building sites are built, the retail units in this development are going to actually part finance the running of the community centre. I just wanted to explain that and set the scene. Essentially, at the moment, there are at least 15 empty shop units in and around the Ashley Road area of Hale, which represents a massive 13% of all of the businesses. When you think about that, in the current climate of retail that's in heavily in decline, I struggle to believe that the Hale Community Trust will manage to rent out the retail unit in this building, which will therefore mean they will not have sufficient funds to run the library building, which calls into question the whole development as a whole. Because if they can't run the library building, you can't put the new library in it. So that's an important point to consider. I would like to stress that I don't think any resident would like to lose the library. I've used it, my wife's used it, our children have used it. But surely rehousing the library in another building would be a better option than building the previous monstrosity that you've just approved. We have other empty buildings in Hale, such as High Street Banks, the Hogans of Hale building, which incidentally is already owned by one of the directors of Hale Community Trust, who are actually putting this application in. The Hale Community Trust and the developers and Trafford Borough Council are set to make huge financial gains from this whole development, both developments. And what I would ask the question is this not a massive conflict of interest where essentially the planning department of Trafford Borough Council are approving Trafford's own development? And surely this should be put in front of an independent body such as another council or either central government. Surely a public inquiry is required because of this conflict of interest. That's all I'd like to say at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kilshaw. If you'd like to return to your seat. We've got other speakers, Councillor Minnis, just hang fire. Mr. Luton, would you like to step forward? And you again have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Right. The final design, which is before you, is very, very strongly supported by the people who are living in Addison Road. They're very pleased with the final design, which addresses all their concerns. They have commented that the development is a minimum, they've given full support to it, and they believe that it will increase the value of their own houses as well. I'd like to clarify one or two of the points which have been made. We, Hale Community Trust, held a 6-week consultation in the library. During that time, the footfall through the library was 8,000. We received 580 letters of support and 20 against. Just clarify the parking situation as well. The number of car parking spaces has not been changed. There's been some rearrangement, but the number is the same. The number of disabled plots has stayed the same, and the your highway authority concluded that the current parking can cope. They didn't believe that there would be any extra pressure on the traffic, and also that there would be no extra car-borne traffic as a result of the development. Finally, on this new development, in addition to the housing, there's going to be another 9 trees planted on top of the 6 which we're planting on Selwyn Road, and there would be further landscaping to the front and rear of the houses, which will improve the landscaping tremendously. What I'm very sorry I forgot to say before, we would like to thank their planners for their patient support and guidance, which has been key to our proposal. And the report before you is outstanding in its scope, diligence, accuracy, and balance. We would like you to approve this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luton. I'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Young, are you going to come and join us again, or you don't think there's anything? Right, that's fine. That's fine.
Not at the current time, thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Bunting, if you'd like to begin the debate, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I find myself as enthusiastic about this application as I did about the last one. I think these, in particular, I do like the design of these. Yes, it's a pity all the applications we don't get aren't as nice as this one. The design, I think, is particularly good, and I think it sits in this site extremely well, and it essentially resolves what is now, well, effectively now a soon to be redundant site following the previous application, because obviously the library will be disappearing once the new building is complete. But as has already been pointed out, it will remain there until such times as that happens. Once that happens, you will effectively have a brownfield site. As we constantly say at this committee over and over again, we want to see brownfield use first. This is going to be a brownfield site. And this new application will fill it most excellently. As I say, the design that's up on the screen in front of you, I think, is a particularly high standard and will fit in very nicely into this area. Just one other point, just to clarify, I'm sure we all know around this table, it would be particularly unusual for us to try and hand over applications to another council, as was suggested by the objector, or to some independent body somewhere. Obviously, there will be no democratic mandate so to do. We are the councillors of Trafford. We are elected by the people of Trafford to represent them in this town hall. It is our job to determine these matters and nobody else's, because nobody else has a democratic mandate from the people of Trafford to carry this out. So I will put that one to one side as well, Chairman, if I may, and simply wish to propose the officer recommendation of grant and look forward to these buildings being built. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Minnis.
Hang on a second. I won't be too long, hopefully. So there were concerns which we're really, really happy with that have been addressed, and I think I like basically the three pairs of semi-detached houses, because there were concerns from residents about the heights of the houses, and obviously whether it be in keeping, whether it be too high. I think that it's great because they're all nice and at the same height as neighbouring properties. The one part where I can't sadly support the application on is actually the shops. Now, people might go, well, it's not a big deal having some shops there, but one, they're not needed. What we actually need is housing. I'd rather have housing there than having any shops at all. The shops aren't needed because we have, as was said by the objector, actually we have empty shops on the high street. I don't believe that these shops are going to succeed. The footfall is going to be lower. You're better off having the shops on the high street occupied. There's also, in additional to that, another reason why not to have the shops is actually it's Lee Road. There's lots of permit parking around this area so that residents can park. So I'm not quite sure where you expect all these, if you were indeed going to be able to fill these spaces where suddenly these people would park. So I can't see that this is, that one aspect is a real shame, because I like the houses. I'd like it to be residential on the corner rather than having shops there. So there's also, obviously, with you've got residential parking, there's going to be, I think there would be a highways issues. Let's say that the shops, units got filled here, you'd have potentially then parking issues. I don't think it'll happen because I don't think they're going to get filled.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Minnis. Ms. Cole.
If I could respond to that, Chairman, I'd just like to remind members this is in a district centre, so the need for any retail units is not really. It's assumed that a district centre can take retail units. The vacancy rate from our latest records is around 12%. That's about standard for turnover in a district centre. It's not excessive. And in terms of parking, you would anticipate that they would that again. General district centre parking, Cecil Road car park, the on-street parking on Ashley Road is available. It's not necessary for somebody visiting a shop to be able to park right outside it, nor is that expected. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. As has already been mentioned by a few other speakers, I think it's great to be on a brownfield site. It replaces a really tired current building. It delivers houses in an area with high demand, and I really, really do like the design. They're in keeping with the local area, and it is. Admittedly, there are retail units there, but we're talking about a few metres away from the main high street. So I will be supporting the plans this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan. Anybody else like to comment? No? It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against? That application has been granted. Thank you. I'm going to go to page 14, that's 6 to 10 Victoria Road in Hale. And we have 2 speakers for this application. Do we have Mr. Spencer? Let's take a seat, Mr. Spencer, and you have 3 minutes. Thank you. Before you do, Mr. Spencer, just hang fire. You have an introduction from Miss Lowes, from Miss Coley, rather.
Thank you, Chairman. This site is located within the Hale Village Centre on the corner of Victoria Road and Lisson Grove. It's within the Hale Station Conservation Area, and the building is classified as a positive contributor within the conservation area in the Conservation Area Appraisals and Management Plan. The application proposes the erection of a single-storey extension to serve the restaurant. 8 letters of support have been received from neighbouring residents, and a representation has also been received from Councillor Mrs Young. The report explains the harm that would arise to the conservation area from the proposals and considered this to be less than substantial in NPPF terms. Less than substantial harm does not, however, equate to a less than substantial objection to the proposals. The proposed extension would harm the appearance of the previously unaltered gable of the property and would obscure original openings at ground floor level. The existing umbrellas cannot be deemed a fallback position as they are unauthorised. It's recognised that the proposal may assist to mitigate previous issues that have arisen from noise generated from the outside seating area through creating a more enclosed space, but only at times when the retractable roof is closed. However, it's considered that previous noise issues could also be addressed through careful management of the outside seating area using existing powers. It's acknowledged that some public benefit could arise from the proposals, but this is not sufficient to outweigh the heritage harm, which must be given great weight in the determination of this application. The application is therefore recommended for refusal on heritage grounds. There are no other issues which would point to further reasons for refusal. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Miss Coley. Mr. Spencer, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
The planning authority's own adopted appraisal and management plan for this conservation area notes that it has 2 very different types of special character. There are leafy residential areas all around Hale, and there is the commercial area. To assess the suitability of this proposal, it must be assessed against the defining significance of the area in which it stands. The adopted appraisal is critical of side extensions in the residential area because they lose the distinctive villa-like separation between dwellings. This property is not in the residential area. It stands in the centre of the commercial area of Ashley Road and Victoria Road, as defined in the appraisal as Area A. That's the council's own appraisal. It stands opposite Hale Station, so it's very central. The appraisal's description of the special character and significance of this area notes that most of the houses have been converted to commercial uses, and almost all have had the gaps between them infilled with side extensions, and the corner plots have been filled in with new commercial development, which wraps around the corner of nearly every road in the conservation area. The council's adopted appraisal notes that this area has a denser, more diverse and urban built form than the residential areas. And there's little room left for infilling. It doesn't say infilling isn't appropriate. It's just that there isn't any room because it's already been infilled. My client is simply proposing the logical infilling of a gap. This gap is presently enclosed with a featureless timber fence, which harms the character of the conservation area. The fence will be removed, and the well-designed corner extension will respond to both street elevations in different ways. It will present a green wall to Lisson Grove and a dignified, attractive shopfront to Victoria Road. Regarding the design of the shopfront, the authority's appraisal notes in relation to this very building that the extended ground floor shop is in keeping with the character of the conservation area. Our design matches as closely as possible with that very design. It would not, therefore, be unduly prominent or out of character. The officer report states that the extension would harm the symmetry of the building at ground floor level. In fact, the building is not symmetrical at ground floor level because the right-hand side has already been infilled with an extension, similar to the one my client proposes on the left-hand side. So rather than unbalance the building, this proposal will improve the symmetry of the building. In conclusion, we submit that our site presents a rare remaining infill opportunity within Area A, and the extension will enhance the character and significance of the conservation area in accordance with the NPPF and your own local planning policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. If you'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Young. You have 5 minutes, Councillor Young. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me speak, Mr. Chairman. I entirely agree with Mr. Spencer's statement and would like to ask you to consider very carefully granting this application, which has the total support of local residents. The owners and designers of Chibo, a family restaurant relying on serving quality food, have worked with the community over the best part of a year to develop a scheme that they fully support and that improves their residential amenity. It has been claimed in the recommendations concluding the officer's report that this design is unduly prominent and out of character. In fact, the proposal is to replace an unsightly fence and 2 big umbrellas with a cleaner build rendered and painted to match the single-story front extension of the existing building, enhanced by planters on the low wall, in which climbing ivy, clematis and geranium will be planted. Very pretty. Standing outside Chibo, looking down Lissam Grove, there can only be an improvement to the present fence, which has been there for over 10 years, and the proposed retracting roof will be invisible. This development will emerge into the background, and it will surely enhance the character and significance of this part of the conservation area. If without moving, you then turn 180 degrees and look towards Hale Station, you will be gazing at the large white faceless block of the Brown Street development, rising substantially higher than the surrounding buildings. And this was considered acceptable a few months ago. The commercial part of the conservation area is within a district shopping centre as defined by the Trafford local plan, which states that the council will promote new development that will consolidate and enhance the vitality and viability of the district centre. The proposed development will do just that. At the moment, many restaurant groups are failing. But this scheme is by a local businessman who has worked with the local community. I mean, he really has. He's talked to every resident in the road and who simply wants to ensure that he has a restaurant of a size that will remain viable and sustainable in the future. I will ask, though, that a condition that all openings of the building close at 8 p.m. to ensure quiet evenings for the residents is put into place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Young. I'd like to return to your seat. Yep, Ms. Cole is going to give us some information.
Thank you, Chairman. I just, the speaker in support of the application, Mr. Spencer, described it on many occasions as an infill. It's not an infill. An infill would be between 2 existing buildings or between two features. This is a side extension, and the conservation area appraisal is quite clear about that they are not deemed to be acceptable. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Councillor Minnis.
Just wanted to speak in favour of the application, actually, because so at the moment you've got a fence and some sort of covering things. It'd be much better to have a solid extension to the building. I think it support the business. It would actually reduce noise for any residents around and going out of the building, because it'd be kept in the building rather than being all open. I can't see why I understand that I think that the public benefits here far outweighs, and for the business to thrive, it's far more important than actually the apparent harm when you've got a monstrosity going over the road. So I can't see why it's for refusing. I'll be supporting this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Minnis. Councillor Patel.
Thank you. I mean, it is actually rather a technical application, and in such cases, I do look to the officer's assessment and recommendations, which in this case I accept. To ignore and override officers' recommendation and assessment is to eat away at the very planning guidance that protects our conservation areas and district centres. It makes a nonsense really of the framework that's in place to prevent unauthorised and inappropriate development. It's been said that the restaurant work has been working closely with the local community, and that's a positive. They could do more. They could manage the existing noise problem through better management of the outdoor areas. That would make a big difference to the residents around them. And I'm afraid I think the applicant in this case needs to think again.
Thank you, Councillor Patel. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also going to be supporting the proposals this evening. I can't see anything in these proposals which would have an adverse effect on the conservation area. I think it improves the current character of the site. As Councillor Young has said, it replaces an unsightly terrace with an in-keeping extension. I think it has a positive impact on the conservation area, and I'm also really pleased that it's got a broad range of support from the local community. So I will be supporting the proposals this evening.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a really, really difficult application. And I'm kind of swinging one way and swinging another way as I'm listening to the discussion. But I think conservation areas are really important. They're important because we want to conserve things. And it is so easy for us as a planning committee to just ride roughshod over the rules, over the recommendations of officers because we like the application or we think it's got support. But people come and go, restaurants come and go, but areas, the preservation of areas in their uniqueness and originality and in their kind of heritage, they stay forever if we let them. And I think that if we actually approve this application, we would be chipping away slowly. And it's with a heavy heart that I can't support the application, but we would be chipping away at our conservation areas, and it would be maybe not this time, but it'd be something else another time. And before we know it, Hale doesn't look like Hale used to do. And so I think it is really hard to say that I don't support the application. I want to see a business that's obviously got loads of support. I want to see it thrive. I want to see it do well. But I think it has to be a kind of combination of preserving the conservation area and allowing the business to develop. So I will be supporting officers with a heavy heart, supporting officers' recommendation to refuse. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cordingley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to echo much of what Councillor Barclay's just said and Councillor Patel. What I've been hearing tonight in terms of those in favour of the application is really to actually get rid of the conservation area, because in some ways we have conservation areas for a reason. We can't just say this one looks quite nice, we'll let it through. We've talked about the umbrellas, but the umbrellas shouldn't be there in the first place. They're not accepted by planning. They should be removed. So that's not the baseline. They need to be removed if we refuse this, because there's no planning permission for them. And it's in a conservation area. A lot of damage has been done to Hale by one-off breaches of the conservation area. We'll let this one through. I think if we're going to have conservation areas, we're going to have to be strict with ourselves. I realise there's a hypocrisy here from me. I would allow that application in an area that wasn't a conservation area. I'd have no hesitation. It is a good application. But Hale is a conservation area. And I really struggle with just saying this one we'll let through. Officers are required to work to the rules that we set them. And then we say, oh, but we like this one. And I think that weakens the whole conservation idea. And I will move to, I'm happy to move to back the officer's recommendation and refuse it.
Thank you. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm finding myself very much in agreement with Councillor Patel, Barclay, and accordingly. Whilst I could, if I was asked to, I'm sure sit over at that seat over there and make a speech either way on this one. I can see both sets of arguments. I'm very much, I do find myself coming down on the side of the officers on this occasion. Councillor Cordingley is absolutely right. This is a case of, yes, if this was elsewhere, if this wasn't a conservation zone, then you probably wave this one through without too much thought. But the point is, it isn't in a conservation area. We have conservation areas for a reason. Now, obviously, if we decided in the future, oh, well, you know what, we'll not bother with these conservation areas anymore, let's just get rid and deal with everywhere in exactly the same way, well, then that would be an argument. One I disagree with, but that would be an argument. But the point is, whilst we're going to continue to have them, we can't sort of say, well, I like this one, or I don't like that other one, or try and play some sort of game of sort of top trumps as to who's got the ugliest planning application and sort of point at other ones and say, well, that one was okay, and I think that's uglier than what we're going for at the minute, therefore I'll wave this one through. So I think the only responsible course of action to take on this occasion is to vote to refuse it. I think Councillor Cordingley is the only one who's made a proposal so far. I don't think it's been seconded, so I'll second that his proposal, i.e. going to refuse in line with officer recommendation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Winstanley.
Just to echo what other people have said, this was a hugely difficult one. When I went to see the site, on the face of it, the development could even be said to add to the general view on the street. However, the swinging argument is this is a conservation area, and the point about conservation areas is we conserve. Therefore, I will be voting against the proposal. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Minish, you'd like to come back in?
I understand it's a conservation area, but we're building on Brown Street car park. We're building a massive monstrosity that's far, far bigger than this. This is going to support the business. This, it's not going to be detrimental at all to the area. It's going to be good. Why? I mean, I wasn't here when obviously Brown Street got approved, but why we want to build a monstrosity there, and that we don't bother about conservation there, but here we're all worried about conservation. It's a bit pot and kettle, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. As I just said a few moments ago, this sort of top trumps with who's got the ugliest planning application argument isn't really the way you can't sort of say, well, okay, we constantly say over time and time again, there's no precedent in planning. We're not talking about Brown Street now. The arguments about Brown Street were held at length in this room. We were both there, Chairman, and we both lived through it. We are now talking about this application site and only this application site. Each application is dealt with in its own merits or lack thereof. And on this occasion, whilst I could, as I said previously, I could probably sit over there and make a 5-minute speech either way on this one, if I was asked to. But the point is, this is a conservation area. We have conservation areas for a reason. If we don't want conservation areas at some point in the future, we could try and maybe look at that, but I wouldn't agree with that argument. So given the fact that we have this conservation area, as was pointed out, it's a bit ridiculous to ask officers to work to one set of rules and then come here and say, oh, well, you know what, on this occasion, let's forget those rules, let's do something different. It might be an easy way out for us. It might make us feel good about ourselves and say, well, I think that'll be okay. But the point is, it's not okay. And just one further point, just to come back, as Mrs. Coley herself pointed out, this is not an infill, this is a side extension. And we need to be clear about that distinction also. And with that said, Chairman, I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm seconding the proposal to refuse, and I'll be voting in that way. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Patel.
It was just to quickly to sort of ask or confirm, Chair, that the purpose of this committee is to discuss the application in front of us and not to compare and contrast to previous decisions, and the inference that the committee played willy-nilly with conservation requirements from one committee meeting to the next is unfounded.
Yeah, can I say to everybody, we are discussing this application when we're not discussing Brown Street, so please let's not talk about that again. Councillor Morgan, you're going to be the last speaker on this item. Briefly, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to be quick. I just want to reiterate the reason that I was supporting this. I think the recommendation is to oppose this because of its sitting scale and design would be unduly prominent and would appear out of character. I don't agree with that. Those views, that will be, despite this being in a conservation, I will be supporting that because I don't agree with the recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan. It's been moved and seconded that we refuse this application. All those in favour of refusal, please show. Those against? That application has been refused. Thank you, everybody. We're going to go to page 121. That's 5 Cranford Road. Do we have Mrs. Blissell? Would like to take a seat? And before you begin, Ms. Blissell, we've got an introduction from Ms. Coley. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. This application relates to a 2-storey detached dwelling sited to the western side of Cranford Road, south of the junction with Chesham Avenue. The application involves the construction of a single-storey side and rear extension and a 2-storey rear extension. The 2-storey element of the rear extension would have a flat roof and project 1.5 metres along the common boundary, with a single-storey element projecting 3 metres. The proposed single-storey side extension will wrap around the property, excluding the existing extension, with a part-hipped, part-flat roof at 3.3 metres wide, with 2.06 metres distance to the northern side boundary with Chesham Avenue. Objections have been received from the occupier of the neighbouring property, 3 Cranford Road, which are summarised in the committee report and the additional information, and have been sent directly to members by the objector. The key considerations are design and the impact on residential amenity for neighbouring properties. The scheme complies with the guidance in SPD 4. Members' attention is drawn to the additional information report, which offers further clarification the number of points raised by the objector, and in particular why it's considered the SPD 4 guidelines have in fact been interpreted correctly by officers. The recommendation is therefore to grant. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Ms. Bissell, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me speak. At the introduction of the Trafford Council SPD 4 guidelines, it states that these guidelines are the minimum standards required when applying for planning permission. In our report, it sets out that the proposal falls below these minimum standards because, firstly, a substantial 2-storey extension to the rear of 5 Cranford Road already exists. The existing extension protrudes to the rear by just over 3 metres, and to comply with the guidelines was set back from our boundary, which is the side wall of number 5, by 1.5 metres. The proposal is to infill this 1.5 metre setback with an additional extension built right up to our boundary, therefore removing the obligatory 1.5 metre setback. This is a clear breach of the guidelines and therefore falls below the minimum standards required. The report for the Planning Committee does not accurately represent our written objection to this, and we totally dispute section 21 of the committee report. The second issue is that the guidelines categorically state that flat roofs will not be accepted. The proposal is for 35% of the roof to be of a flat roof design, both the rear extension and the single-storey side extension. The flat roofs will be clearly visible from the street and our own garden. How can the proposed flat roofs meet the minimum standards if the guidelines deem them not acceptable? Thirdly, the plans have been very slightly amended from those submitted in autumn 2018. However, there would still be a large expanse of brickwork right on our border where our garden terrace is, due to the required 1.5 metre setback being removed. This will inevitably be overbearing and will create an uncomfortable sense of enclosure on our garden terrace. Your guidelines state that a large expanse of brickwork can be overbearing to the amenities of a neighbouring property and should not have an adverse overlooking, loss of light or overbearing impact on neighbouring properties. We have 2 further quick points to raise. The applicant is employed by Trafford Council. We would expect the council to ensure their guidelines apply equally to an employee as to any other applicant. Despite the agent's assertions regarding foundation design, we consulted a chartered structural engineer who has viewed the site, and they categorically state that the foundations will need to undermine our land and therefore will cause encroachment beyond their boundary. We appreciate this is a civil matter and not a planning issue, but we'd like this noted for the record. In overview, your guidelines specifically state that the council has a duty to safeguard the amenity of neighbouring properties and to ensure that a high standard of design is achieved. How can this extension, which falls below the minimum standards set out in the guidelines, meet both the minimum requirements and be of a high standard of design? Finally, I would like to thank the councillors who came to the views proposed extension from our side of the fence.
Would you like to return to your seat? Thank you. Do we have Miss Duckworth? Miss Duckworth, if you'd like to take a seat, and you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application has been amended in order to meet the planning guidelines following the submission that we did earlier last year, and we feel that it now meets those guidelines. We have spoken extensively to the planning officers and also consulted with the other neighbours on Cranford Road and Chesham Avenue who are in full support of this application. We believe that the proposed extension would be in keeping with the area and is of a reasonable size to have no impact upon the street scene. The proposed two-storey extension will not breach the boundary of the two properties, nor the building work will be kept within the curtilage of our boundary. The flat roof has been designed to reduce the impact on the neighbouring property. Because it's a corner property, it has different roof angles, so we felt that a flat roof would be better so that it didn't look wrong. I believe the boundary lines as proposed by number 3 on the 5th of August are incorrect and do not reflect those that exist on the deeds of the property. However, I believe this is not a matter for the planning committee. In conclusion, I would just ask that you follow the officer recommendation and grant the application.
Thank you, Mrs. Duckworth. You'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Bunting, you'd like to begin the debate?
Thank you, Chairman. Just in terms of the, if I could take the last point first, if I may, from the objector, and second to last point first, and that is that staff members will be treated somehow more favourably, or the suspicion of the argument that they could be treated more favourably than any other member of the public. This is clearly not the case. Indeed, if anything, it's the other way around, because to say, as all staff applications or applications relating to staff, or indeed councillors, have to come before this committee, whereas many applications that are submitted by staff, and I suspect this could well be one of them, that if it were not for the fact that they were a staff member, they would be dealt with through the quality panel. So whilst this committee may or may not choose to grant or refuse the application, one thing it most certainly has done is slow the process down. It delays the process. It was exactly the same when I had my application put before this council. It was delayed by the fact that I'm a councillor, and therefore it had to come to planning committee. So the argument that we somehow treat staff more favourably is something that I take particular exception to. In terms of the other arguments put forward, the objector does mention numerous times guidelines. The guidelines are precisely that, Chairman, as you well know. They are there to guide. They are not a straitjacket to inform us of what we must and must not do. They are there to inform our decision. And there is always a degree of flexibility and discretion in relation to matters. And that's what that's what has resulted in the arguments from the officers today. In terms of the flat roof, for example, I do agree that given the circumstances, yes, flat roofs are often restricted, but given the circumstances, a flat roof may prevent problems with roof lines and what have you that would prevent the building from looking reasonable in given its location. And as the officers pointed out in their report, the one thing that was perhaps needed to prevent that being an issue in the future was to put restrictions in terms of what the flat use may be used for example, a seating area. The officers have restricted that by a condition, and therefore, although they have allowed the flat roof to go through, they have then mitigated any problems that may cause by that condition. In terms of the actual building itself, this build itself, I think this will fit in well within this location. I think it will suit the plot into which it is to be built. In terms of the pointed out by both objector and applicant, matters such as encroachment and as to whether the boundary line is correct, entirely irrelevant. Nothing whatsoever to do with us, as has been pointed out earlier in this meeting. We deal with the matters that we deal with. That is a private dispute between these two neighbours. Has no bound on the planning application whatsoever, and therefore those are matters that I'm not taking into account because there are no grounds for me to take them into account. With that said, Chairman, I think I've covered all the points I wish to make, and so the simple one final point for me to say is that I therefore will be proposing that we grant this application in line with officer recommendation, and look forward to hearing the comments of my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Minnis.
I'd like to echo what Councillor Bunting said about obviously employees or indeed councillors and any favourable treatment. They don't get any favourable treatment. It's the complete opposite, if anything. But onto the matter of this, I have a question, and it's a kind of a concern, but I'd like to know what the rules are, and whether this is actually a real issue, if that makes any sense, or not. So I believe there's been an extension already on the property, and this is an extension to add on to the extension. Correct. Right. Okay. The original extension, we had a 1.5 metre rule away from the boundary, and now, so there's a gap, and now we're closing that gap. So does that not break those rules? And if it was indeed it's okay to go that close, why wasn't that? That was clearly not allowed in the first place. But we're adding on and seeing how far we can get. So if that'd be great if I can know.
Yes, certainly. The existing extension has got a 3 metre projection. So in order to go out 3 metres, you have to have 1.5 metres from the boundary. That doesn't prevent you in the future infilling the gap between the existing extension and the boundary, provided that also complies with the guidelines. Now, on the boundary, you can only project 1.5 metres. This extension only projects 1.5 metres. So it complies at that point. I've no knowledge that a previous application was refused for the scheme as now proposed. Had the scheme been proposed as one extension in the first place, it would have been granted planning permission. It complies with the guidelines.
So the old extension goes out 3 metres. Is that what you're saying? It's out the back. Okay. And then this new bit that's being added on, and not the flat roof bit, is the bit I'm concerned about, the bit near the boundary. Is that going out the whole 3 metres?
At single storey, yes, but our guidelines allow 3 metres at single storey and 1.5 metres at 2 storey. So it complies exactly with our guidelines on the boundary.
There's a slope. It's not. Right. Sorry, can you show me a picture? Sorry. I just want clarity. Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
1.5 metres on the boundary at 2 storey, 3 metres on the boundary at 2 storey, at single storey complies with the guidelines. Exactly. 3 metres at 2 storey, 1.5 metres away from the boundary also complies with the guidelines. They're 2 different operations, but had they been one, they've got one. The whole thing complies.
Okay, thank you.
Any other members wish to comment? Okay, I went to view this site on Sunday, and we had representation from Mr. and Mrs. Bissell, and I had a look at this, and I walked round for a time. On the extension to the side of the property onto, is it Chesham Avenue, that single-storey flat roof, Miss Bissell talks about the flat roof being out of keeping with the area. I don't think that flat roof will be seen by residents so much from the avenue there at the side. I don't particularly like the flat roof, and I'd have liked it to have been the same as the original building, but that is not the case, and I don't think I've got strong enough reason to turn the application down on that issue. It's not such a big issue for me. So I caught Mr. and Mrs. Bissell in, and I had a look inside and talked specifically about the area that Councillor Minnis is talking about. And it does fit our criteria. Mr. and Mrs. Bissell have got a different interpretation of it, and they're perfectly entitled to that. But it does fit our criteria. So when I looked at it, I thought, does this have such an impact on those residents on number 3 that I would think it would be justified to refuse this application? If I thought it did, even if it fitted the guidelines, if I thought it affected those residents, I would be saying I don't support this application. But I don't think it will. I know they've got concerns about it. They live right next door and it's up to the boundary. But I don't think those are sufficient reasons to turn this application down. So I heard what Councillor Bunting had to say, and I support what he said. I'll be seconding the motion that we grant this application. So I'll be seconding the application. Don't know if anybody else wishes to comment. If no one wishes to comment, then we'll move to a vote. It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against, that's unanimous. That application has been granted. Thank you, everybody. We're going to go to page 149. That's 15 Carsvale Avenue in Urmston. And we have Councillor Harding and Mr. Walker speaking to this application. I don't know who wants to go first. Councillor Proctor's excusing himself from the room. Councillor Harding is going to come first. I'd like to take a seat, Councillor Harding, and you have 5 minutes.
Sorry.
Before you do that, Miss Lowes is going to give us a brief introduction. Miss Lowes.
Thank you, Chair. 15 Carvale Avenue. This application relates to a 2-storey semi-detached property positioned on the corner junction of Carvale Avenue and Balfour Road. The application proposes the erection of a part single, part 2-storey side extension. The application has been called into committee by Councillor Harding, and there have been no other letters of representation received. The key consideration is the visual impact and prominence of the proposed side extension within the street scene. Due to the proximity to the side boundary on this prominent corner plot, its scale, height and massing. The development is considered to create a cramped form of development that would be obtrusive and over-dominant within the street scene, out of character with the spaciousness of the application site. The proposal would have a detrimental impact on visual appearance and character. As such, the application is recommended for refusal.
Thank you, Miss Lowes. Councillor Harding.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that I won't take 5 minutes because I understand that Mr. Walker has a more detailed representation to make. So I've called in this planning application on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Walker, who have requested me as their ward councillor to speak on their behalf this evening. I have visited the proposed site of the application, and I consider what is proposed does not have an adverse impact upon the character and appearance of the area. I don't consider this application to be particularly onerous or obstructive and over-dominant in that area, really, and not to have a dominant and negative impact upon the street scene as suggested in the planning report. I also understand that there have not been any neighbour objections, but I will seek clarity from Mrs. Coley and planning. Is that right? No objections. And Councillor Bunting made reference to guidelines earlier on, so that there is scope to discuss and consider guidelines that have been put forward by officers. So really, I'm just representing residents of Urmston, and I have visited the site, so supporting Mr. and Mrs. Walker with this application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harding. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, we can't have any material passed around to members. Sorry. You should be allowed to speak this evening. Thank you. You have 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Walker.
I'd like to start by clarifying 2 areas in the report. We have a 4-bedroom property, not a 3-bedroom house, but it does feel like a 3-bed house because the 4th bedroom is a box room, which is what we're seeking to amend today. The application is also not as close to the boundary as the report states. We're proposing leaving a 1 metre and 1.3 metre gap to the boundary rather than a 0.8 metre and 1 metre gap as the report states. That is in here and that was on Trafford Council's website. In its reason for refusal, the planning report states the proposed 2-storey side extension by reason of its siting scale, height and massing and proximity to the side boundary on a prominent corner plot would create a cramped form of development that would be obtrusive and over-dominant within the street scene and would be out of character with the spaciousness of the surrounding area. We want to look at those arguments one by one. Preparing this, we spoke to a former planner at Plymouth Council who has a Masters of Science in Planning, Practice and Research. As she says, the street scene is a complete mixed bag, and the properties that exist on the street are not as spacious as implied. When you actually see what a community is like on pages 12 and 13 here, you will see that application is not over-dominant or out of character with the spaciousness of the surrounding area, which under the previous planning guidance has allowed 4 semi-detached homes to be sandwiched together on our streets on multiple occasions. This is not a spacious street scene as implied. The planning report states that our planning application is obtrusive and over-dominant. However, the planning report also states that the proposal would not result in any unacceptable overbearing, overshadowing or overlooking impact on any neighbouring properties at the front, side or rear. We believe this proposal is not obtrusive and over-dominant as it is not proven not to result in any overbearing, overshadowing or overlooking impact on any neighbouring properties. The planning report on our application states that proximity is a reason for refusal. However, we have already had planning permission granted for an extension 1 metre away, as there is no defined boundary line to the northern side of Balfour Road. Therefore, proximity alone should not be a reason to rule out the proposed extension. What is it that we're asking for? We know from emails, phone conversations, and the general guidance on extensions for corner plots which have regular building lines onto the street that the guidance states that a minimum of 2 metres be retained between the side of the extension and the back of the development. Leaving a 2 metre gap between the proposed extension and the boundary would mean that a 16 metre gap would exist between the extension and our nearest neighbours. As you would be able to see on page 5, our street has no building lines on it whatsoever, and leaving a 1 metre and 1.3 metre gap between the proposed extension and the boundary would mean extending our house just 6.25% into the distance between our nearest neighbours at 13 Carswell Avenue and 1 Balfour Road, which is a spacious street, as you can see on page 18. As the planning report states, this would create a 15 metre distance and create no significant loss of light or sense of overbearing. As such, it is our representation to the Planning Committee that the siting scale, height, massing and proximity of our proposal, which extends our property a further 6.25% into that gap, would not represent a cramped form of development, nor would be obtrusive, over-dominant in the street scene, or be out of character with the spaciousness of the surrounding area in any way. This is a carefully thought-out proposal for a modest extension of 2.7 metres, which in a neighbourhood which is very passionate about protecting what we have has not received any objections from any neighbours, which is in stark contrast to when Amy submitted a planning application to create a controlled parking zone on our street, and by the next day, pretty much the whole street had signed it. We know that councillors will judge this application on its individual merits, and we welcome you to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. If you'd like to return to your seat. Any members wish to open the debate? Councillor Winstanley.
On now. When I visited the site, I didn't see the cramped development referred to in the papers. The gable end of the existing house is already very close to the pavement. It is not a spacious street scene as it currently stands. And I don't think the extension would have any real effect on the way that part of Carswell Avenue actually looks. It is, as the last speaker said, it's a mixed bag of development on the road. And I don't think that the extension would be over-dominant in the street scene. I don't think it would be out of character. I don't think it would have detrimental impact on the visual appearance. And what's really swings it for me is there are no objections from any of the neighbours. And in fact, I think the speaker mentioned there was a overwhelming support. They're not an official consultation. So I will vote in favour of allowing the extension.
Thank you, Councillor Winstanley. Councillor Minnis.
I've looked at this and I've seen actually similar developments elsewhere. I'm not saying that, you know, that's reason to approve or not to approve. But I think that it actually would improve the property, I think, really well. And I think it would actually think it makes the side look better, to be honest, the way that it's all staggered and that, I think it looked better. I can't see, you can still walk around the side because over a metre width there, you can have a gate there and walk around the side of it. You know, I don't see how it's actually going to be detrimental. When you look down the street, you can still look down the street. There's not going to change anything. I don't really see why, we've been recommended to refuse. I'll be supporting. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Councillor Patel.
I mean, again, this is a rather technical report that's before us, and within which the applicant has brought forward a number of examples where he feels that this type of development has been allowed in Trafford, but it's clear that none of those apply here. I mean, on my street, there's an array of extensions from the 1950s to the 80s, 90s that would never get permission now. So I don't know that you can look at what's happened before. As you approach Carsvale, the two corner plots, there is an open aspect to the entrance to the avenue, and I can understand if you were looking from that a side extension would impact on that. That's where I see that would have a detriment to the street scene there. I mean, all of us who have young families would really like to extend our properties, but we are all restricted by planning guidance, which allows or doesn't allow us to do what we want to do in our homes. So again, on this rather technical report, I'm going to defer to the assessment and the recommendations of the officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to agree with the previous speaker, Councillor Patel. She more or less has gone through the argument in the way I was going to go. I was just waiting to sort of get a few more views to sort of see what other people think, but obviously everyone else who wanted to speak has already done so, apart from Councillor Patel and myself. I agree with Councillor Patel absolutely. As you're driving into the road and you're looking left and right as you're manoeuvring through that junction, which isn't the widest road in the world, you can, because of the open nature of that junction, see very clearly to the left and right. The officers are quite right in this point. By putting this extension on the side of this building, you will more enclose that junction to a substantial degree. You will make it look cramped. It will stand out like a sore thumb. It will be very, very obvious. Now, I appreciate why the resident wishes to do this. It's to maximise the use of their plot. They could build to the rear, for example, an extension that would probably be far more acceptable in terms of planning. But they're obviously trying to maintain the maximum size of garden available, and therefore they're going for the side instead. That's understandable. I can see that that's what they want to do. But unfortunately, it's good for them, but then bad for everyone else. In terms of the number of residents objecting, well, again, we're back to the top trumps in planning applications, who's got the most objectors. It doesn't matter if there are no other objectors. We have numerous times in this planning committee before refused applications where no one has objected. Why? Because it's in breach of planning regulations. As was pointed out to me, these are guidelines. Yes, they are guidelines, Chairman, as with everything else. There is always room for a discussion. Otherwise, there's no point in this committee. But at the end of the day, they're not there to be completely disregarded. And you can have a degree of discretion, but you can't disregard entirely. So on those grounds, Chairman, I will be agreeing with the previous speaker. She's already proposed it. I'm more than happy to second it, that we go with officer recommendation and refuse. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. Barclay. You can't come in, Mr. Walker. Thank you. No, really, Mr. Walker, you can't come in. Thank you. Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. It is a really difficult application to judge. I could be persuaded either way, but I don't really have the technical expertise. I don't have the knowledge and training of the planning officers. So very similar to Councillor Patel, I really have to be guided when I don't really know what the impact would be and what it would actually look like. I need to be guided by the expert view of the officer. So I will be supporting officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cordingley.
I'm going to be supporting Councillor Winstanley in this because I think I appreciate I've made the case for going with officers on a previous one tonight, but in this is a very distinct corner, and it seems to me that actually there's no reason why this extension doesn't work there. I cannot see, I don't think planning would ever be able to create rules that allowed this and not others, and that's why we're here. This one, it seems to me, allows us to depart from planning rules because of the nature of it being on a corner, because of the nature of Carswell Avenue, which is fairly compact and self-contained, and the fact that there's no objections is significant in this because everybody knows everybody on that road. And I just back Councillor Winstanley on this one. I think he made the case very well.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. Was quite similar to a number of other speakers. I was quite torn on this, and I've got quite a bit of sympathy about the development. But I did, when you do come in on Balfour Road, it is quite a distinct, symmetrical junction. And so if you read the reasons for the recommendation to be refused, it is about the prominent corner plot. So I am guided by officer recommendations, and I'll be supporting refusing the application tonight.
Thanks for that. Anybody else like to comment? Okay, it's moved and seconded that we go with the officer's recommendation to refuse this application. All those in favour of refusal, please show. And those against refusal, I think that's been refused. Yep, that application has been refused. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go to page 99, that's Stretford Grammar School in Granby Road, and there are no speakers to this item. Councillor Jerome. Thank you, Councillor Jerome. That's for you to decide. I think everybody knows the people at one bit close. Yes. Yes, thank you for that. Councillor Winstanley.
Just a declaration of my kids went to this school, so I don't think I've got an interest as such, but just to declare that.
Thank you. Miss Lowes is going to give us an introduction. Miss Lowes.
Thank you, Chair. Stretford Grammar School. Planning permission is sought for the erection of a single-storey extension to the north of the main school building to provide 6 additional classrooms and associated facilities. The application site is located in the Greenbelt. 5 letters of objection have been received, and a petition containing 11 signatures have also been received, raising concerns in relation to the impact on Greenbelt, highways and parking, and noise and pollution in particular. The development is considered to be an appropriate development in the Greenbelt and would have very limited harm to its openness. Substantial weight has been afforded to this harm. However, officers, in accordance with the NPPF, consider that the applicant has demonstrated very special circumstances through the provision of public benefits of an additional intake of 120 pupils, mainly from disadvantaged backgrounds, that the additional classroom space would allow. It is considered that these very special circumstances would outweigh the identified harm in Greenbelt terms. The development is considered to be well designed and of an appropriate height and mass for its location. It will not adversely impact on residential amenity, nor will it result in any undue impact on the local highway network. It is considered that the proposed development is acceptable in all respects, and the application is recommended for approval subject to conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lowes. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. This will be extremely brief. This is something to be welcomed. This is an excellent addition to Trafford Council's most excellent education establishment. I'm well aware that in many of the objections, there's been a great deal of play made about the fact that it's a green belt. But as the officer has already clearly pointed out, yes, there is very limited harm, but that is overwhelmingly negated by the high level of public benefit which you would associate with something like this. We need to have spaces available in our schools for our children to attend. That's a critical function of this council and something that we won't shy away from. In terms of the other issues such as traffic management and all this, again, I don't believe that the impact is going to be anywhere near the level that is stated. The idea that this is going to have a huge influx of extra staff, it's not that big an extension, and therefore when you've got the access in through the entrance at the end of the road, I don't believe that will be substantially impacted upon at all. On those grounds, Chairman, I believe this is something to be welcomed. It's a good news story, and I'm more than happy to propose that we accept officer's recommendation and grant it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. It's very nice to always have applications to develop schools so that they can take on additional pupils. This is going to provide 5 new classrooms, a science lab, which is very exciting, and an office, and new toilets as well, which are absolutely critical in some of our schools. The toileting facilities are absolutely awful, so it's really great to see that too. So I have absolutely no hesitation in supporting the application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dr. Barclay. Anybody else like to comment? Councillor Proctor.
Thank you, Chair. Go along what's already been said, really, and happy to recommend the grant. This is going to be a real good addition to the school. Benefits is really needed. Looking through the report, I see a number of concerns have been raised by local residents, but I think they've been addressed throughout the report in a very comprehensive way. I don't think the residents who live locally will be negatively impacted in any significant way by this development, and its single-storey scale and height is appropriate and is proportionate in relation to the existing building. Essentially, it is a good fit, I think, and it will visually look good in terms of the school itself. It's also, I think, far enough from residential properties not to have a bearing impact or being overlooked by them. And I think the disturbances that have been mentioned by a couple of the residents will be minimal and just part of what happens being in a school. I think the design is good and it will give a good visual appearance of the school. So I can't really see any reasons why this should be refused, and I will wholeheartedly support it. So I'll be recommending to grant. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Proctor. Anybody else? Councillor Jerome. Thank you, Councillor Jerome. Anybody else? Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be supporting this development tonight. I think it's, I do take very seriously that it's on technically on Greenbelt land, but I think it's appropriate for improving the amenities in the school. And I see very few reasons to oppose it. I think when I've read through the objections, I think, as has already been said, I think the report already answers most of those. So I'll be supporting the recommendation tonight.
Thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Councillor Minnis.
Thank you. I had a look at this and I thought, obviously we don't want to be developing greenbelt land, but it's given that it's going out I haven't quite got the orientation in my head, but going out the side where you've got all the buildings and you've got, that I think I don't then have a problem. If it went out the other side, I would have great problems with it. I think that, if you're going to call the whole land green belt, then yes, obviously technically it is, but I think that the benefit actually to the school, to our the children and families here is far outweighs the potential harm. I do see, though, however, with Councillor Jerome saying about actually the transport and how are they going to, where are the plans to, encourage, and this is the same actually with all schools. I'd like to see encouragement of children walking and cycling to school rather than, being dropped off by parents in a car all the time. So I would like to see that, but it's not a reason for me to reject what's being proposed. If it was coming out the other side, I'd have major issues, but it's coming out the right side for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mace. I think Ms Cole is going to give us some advice. Ms Cole.
Yes, just if I can offer some reassurance to Councillors Jerome and Minnis that conditions 14 and 15 relate to additional cycle parking and to a full travel plan. So those issues have been addressed, but are being addressed through planning condition. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. Those against? Just Councillor Jerome, that application has been granted. And the last one, I think, is number 160. That's 14 Sidmouth Avenue. Yes, bring him back in. There are no speakers to this item. Anybody like to open the debate? Councillor Bunting, before you do that, we're going to have an introduction from Miss Lowes.
Thank you, Chair. 14 Sidmouth Avenue. The application site comprises of a two-storey detached dwelling located at the end of a residential cul-de-sac. The application seeks permission for a single-storey rear extension, projecting 4.5 metres from the rear elevation. The application is reported to committee as the applicant is an employee of the council. The key considerations in this case are the design and its impact on residential amenity of the occupiers of neighbouring properties. Officers consider the development is acceptable in design terms and its impact on visual amenity and has no unacceptable impacts on residential amenity and is therefore recommended for approval subject to conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lowes. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. Just as part of before I go into the actual application itself, just on page 160, as has been pointed out, it states that this application is with us this evening because the person is related to a council officer. The applicant told me apparently the applicant is a second cousin of a planning officer. So the argument that, as I'm not entirely certain who all my second cousins are, Chairman, and so the argument that was put forward earlier, just for the public record, as we are being filmed, the argument that this council does not take its responsibilities seriously in terms of its council employees and making sure that everything is dealt with scrupulously can be put to bed once and for all. With that point made, Chairman, this is a absolutely fine application. There is no real reason to even consider refusing it. As I said, the only reason it's with us this evening because that very tenuous link to a council officer, and therefore, Chairman, I'm simply going to propose that we accept officer recommendation and grant. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Minnis.
I was actually quite amused by the fact that a second cousin, their planning applications come in. I'll have to, remember that. I don't think I have many second cousins around in Trafford. It's fine, but I'd say I don't like the look of it, but that's not a reason to say no. So yeah, supporting. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you seconding Councillor Bunting's proposal, Ms. Smith? Yes. It's been proposed that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against, that is unanimous. The application has been granted. Now, we have actually got some late important business. Excuse me, and Mrs. Brown is going to give us an update on some very important information. Mrs. Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it concerns a planning appeal decision that came through this week. The planning application proposed a 64-bedroom care home on the site of one dwelling at Bankhall Lane, Hale. And at May's meeting of the Planning Committee, it was explained that an appeal against the application's non-determination had been lodged, and a report was presented to members at that time to establish the stance to adopt at a forthcoming planning inquiry. That inquiry, which lasted 8 days in total, took place in June this year, and the council's case centred around 3 reasons for refusal. Firstly, a detrimental impact upon landscape character. Secondly, harm arising to the adjacent conservation area. And lastly, unjustifiable impacts to protected species. There were further concerns of the council surrounding the model of care proposed, the lack of need for the type of facility, the site's unsustainable location,
the limited garden space for residents, and the lack of opportunity for those residents to integrate with the community. So the council put forward 5 witnesses to defend its case, and with a barrister appointed to present the arguments to an independent planning inspector. The applicant did the same, and a local residents group was also formally participating in the process in complementing the council's position. The inspector's decision was released yesterday, and it was confirmed that the appeal had been dismissed and that planning permission would not be granted. The inspector agreed that the proposed development would be damaging to landscape character. In addition, it was accepted that the site had poor access to the local area for prospective residents, and that the harm and model of care proposed was inappropriate. The arguments regarding harm to protected species and to the conservation area were not accepted, however. Trafford's lack of a 5-year housing land supply was acknowledged by the inspector, and it was indeed accepted that the proposal would make a useful contribution to housing targets. Nonetheless, the inspector agreed with the council that overall the benefits of the development would be significantly and demonstrably outweighed by the harms. Officers have concluded that the inspector's position regarding the site's locational shortcomings for future residents is likely to preclude any further proposal for a care home development on this site, even if it were reduced in size. Overall, officers have welcomed the decision, which confirms that new housing should not be accepted at any cost, even when the tilted balance is engaged. However, there were a series of established harms particular to this case.
Councillor Dr. Barclay.
Thank you so much for that. Could you remind us how Planning Committee voted on that?
Yes, the decision in May, which was for the 64-bedroom care home, was to proceed unanimously with the officer's recommendation, which was based upon those 3 indicative reasons for refusal. And prior to that, in April 2018, the committee had unanimously refused a similar application for a slightly larger care home.
Thank
you. Councillor Bunting.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to, through you, of course, place on record thanks, certainly on my behalf, and I imagine on behalf of the entire committee, to all the council officers who worked so hard, be they planning officers, legal officers, highways input, democratic services. There was a huge amount of work involved, both in the preparation of the case and in the run up to it, and then also in the organising of the actual event that was held just across the corridor. So on all our behalf, I would like to propose that we have a vote of thanks to all the officers involved and thank them for the hard work that they did, Chairman.
Thank you for that, Councillor Bunting. I think it echoes what everybody's thinking. It would have been a very expensive case to lose that. A lot of money spent on that case. No? Okay, we'll close the meeting. Thank you.